Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight to discuss the launch of Thou Shalt Not Stand Idly By. It's a book rooted deeply in Tanenbaum's shared values, telling a hopeful story of how sworn enemies, Syrians and Israelis, Muslims and Jews, can rise above politics and mutual suspicion to alleviate suffering. I'm Mark Fowler. I'm the CEO of the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding, your host for the conversation this evening. Again, welcome. I'd like to start this session, as I've been trying to do with all of our sessions, with a land acknowledgement. Tanenbaum's offices currently sit on the recognized land of the Munsee Lenape people. And so I'd like to take just a brief moment of silence and acknowledgement of the elders of that tribe, and that they would look favorably upon this time we are sharing together. Thank you. During our time together this evening, I first want to introduce our very special guest, Dr. Georgette Bennett, and then we will have a conversation about her newly launched book, Thou Shalt Not Stand Idly By, which I'm very excited to be sharing with you this evening. And then we'll have a little conversation between she and I, talking about the context of the Syrian conflict, the impact of building bridges across lines of difference to alleviate suffering, humanitarian diplomacy, and the transcendent value of peace building within conflicts globally. Certainly like the devastating Russian invasion and unfolding that we see in the Ukraine right now. And there will be time at the end of our conversation for those of you who are joining us to have the opportunity to drop your own questions into the chat. So if you will help me, Georgette, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And I have a brief introduction of you. To actually go through your full vita, we probably wouldn't be able to have much time to talk about the book. But Dr. Georgette Bennett is Tanenbaum's founder and president. She is also the founder of the Multi-Faith Alliance for Syrian Refugees. Dr. Bennett is an award-winning sociologist, a widely published author, popular lecturer, and former broadcast journalist. And Georgette, thank you so much for making the time to be with us this evening. I also wanted to introduce everyone just to this conversation that we're having is actually part of a larger series of conversations that we're calling our 3000 Conversations series. Tanenbaum is celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. And over the first 30 years of our work, we've seen the value of people having authentic and intentional conversations around building respect for religious difference and what it means for them in their real lives. What are some of the things that we have to attend to, and for the people around them. So as part of our programming for our 30th anniversary, we are engaging in this series of 3000 Conversations for Building Respect as an opportunity for all of us within Tanenbaum's community, new and old, to use our resources, use conversations like the one you're going to hear this evening, to really think about and dig into how do we practically and actually build respect for religious difference. How do we do that? And what's required of each of us in order to have a world where differences are respected? And how can we support each other in these endeavors? So 3000 Conversations are an opportunity for all of us to just organically and authentically explore what it means to promote justice and build respect in the communities that we're members of. So there's more that we'll be sharing. You can follow the link that's in the chat to talk about it. So without any further ado, please let me welcome Dr. Georgette Bennett for our conversation this evening.
Thank you, Mark. I want to know which of the 3000 conversations is this one?
This is actually, I believe, the fourth of our 3000 conversations. So we're kind of at the beginning of the whole thing.
This is the beginning. Okay.
This is the beginning. And then anyone who watches the recording will be able to count that as a conversation.
So I have one request before we get going. If we could stop the screen share and take my book cover off, because I'm finding it very disconcerting to stare at my book cover. I'd much rather stare at you, Mark, and there you are.
It is such a pleasure. I am so excited about this conversation. First, I would really love, because we're going to be talking about a lot of things, but I'd love if you would talk a little bit about the founding of the Multi-Faith Alliance for Syrian Refugees, because certainly it's covered in the book, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how it all came to be.
Well, it all came to be because of a report that I read that the International Rescue Committee issued in January 2013. It was a report on the Syrian crisis, and I had been on the board of IRC for some years at that point. But being a typical overextended New Yorker, that report sat on my desk for several months before I had a chance to open it. But when I finally did open it, I was absolutely stunned by the magnitude of this crisis, and equally stunned by the silence of the world in the face of this crisis. And that reminded me of my own roots because of the silence of the world during the Holocaust. So being a child of the Holocaust, being a refugee myself, I felt that I had to do something. I could not stand idly by while the blood of my neighbor cried out from the earth. That was Leviticus 19:16. That just kept reverberating in my brain. So the something that I did was to start with a Jewish communal response, because I wasn't seeing one. And of course, it seemed a bit counterintuitive to expect one, given the way that Syrians are indoctrinated about Jews and about Israel. But still, I just felt commanded to do something. I had been working with the Jordanian ambassador to the UN at that time, and he had suggested that I scale this up to a multi-faith response, specifically under the auspices of the Tanenbaum Center. And the Tanenbaum Center was actually the host of the launch event for the Multi-Faith Alliance. And for a period of time, the Multi-Faith Alliance for Syrian Refugees was actually housed at the Tanenbaum Center. And with Tanenbaum's help, in terms of helping this infant learn how to walk and eventually be able to go to school and do things for itself, we spun off and became an independent organization. So that's how the Multi-Faith Alliance started. So thank you, Tanenbaum.
I remember it well, and it was completely our pleasure. So I want to talk a little bit now about, so we're in the space where the Syrian conflict has been going on. It started 10 years ago.
11 now. This
wow.
is the 11th year.
Wow. So 11 years ago. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the conflict looks like now, because this, as is with the case with so many other conflicts, they seem to kind of fade into the background, although the conflict itself is alive and well.
Well, that's absolutely correct, Mark. Syria has long dropped out of the headlines and been superseded by Afghanistan and Ukraine. But it's been said, and I think it's accurate, that the war in Ukraine began in Syria. And the reason it began in Syria is because what we are seeing Russia do in Ukraine today is absolutely the same playbook that it used in Syria. Because the Syrian war is a proxy war between Russia and Iran on one side and the US and Saudi Arabia on the other side. Russia has been running the air war in Syria and Iran running the ground war. So it's still very much going on, although the regime has been able to reclaim a lot, but not all, of the territory that the opposition had been holding on to. But Syria is in a state of complete devastation. 80% of the country has sunk into poverty. The average life expectancy has been reduced by 20 years. Half of the country's population is displaced, and of those displaced, half are refugees outside the country and half are refugees inside the country. There are shortages of everything. The medical infrastructure has been destroyed, deliberately bombed, deliberately attacked as a weapon of war. The educational infrastructure has been destroyed. What more is there to say about what the current state of play is?
And, you know, one of the things that I remember hearing recently from the Ukrainian crisis, the war in the Ukraine, is, you know, there are these kind of adulations about welcoming refugees in the United States and in other parts of the world, but particularly around coming to the United States. That is not an overnight or easy process. And we are now kind of like in another state of crisis, if you will, with the numbers of people around the world who are refugees or internally displaced persons, and in some instances seeking resettlement to try and build a life somewhere else until they can return home. What are you seeing? And when we think about the book, I'd love to know your thoughts about just the systems that currently exist and what the challenges are for Syria.
Well, there are more than 80 million displaced persons in the world right now. It's a huge number. And of those, the largest refugee and displacement crisis is among Syrians. 25% of those, of the refugees, are Syrians. The machinery for resettling refugees, at least in the US, is completely broken down because it was dismantled in the prior administration. So even though President Biden has committed to bringing 125,000 refugees into the country this year, it's unlikely that more than 20,000 will actually come in. There are 29,000 Syrian refugees, by the way, who are already fully vetted and in the pipeline, and they still have not been able to get into the country. The US has probably the most stringent refugee admissions processes in the world. You have to be vetted by a dozen different agencies, and you cannot set foot in the country until you're fully vetted. And that's one of the things that slows everything down. Because of COVID, the US has not been able to send USCIS personnel overseas to do the interviews on site. So you might ask the question, so why can't the interviews be done via Zoom? Well, of course they can be done via Zoom. And in fact, that was one of the recommendations of a Harvard Law School study, which was done in consultation with the Multi-Faith Alliance. The other problem is that the US accepts refugees only through UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. And their pipelines are also clogged. But the State Department used to run trainings so that other organizations could be certified to do the initial processing of refugees. Those trainings stopped many years ago. But that's something else that we could do to speed up the process. Right now, it takes about 2 years, between 18 months and 2 years for a refugee to be vetted. And in all of that time, they are there in limbo. Another problem is that the average time of displacement, you mentioned take care of refugees until they go home again. Well, the truth is that the odds, especially in the case of Syrian refugees, of their ever going home again, are practically non-existent. The average time of displacement for refugees overall and displaced persons overall is 17 to 27 years. Those Syrians who have voluntarily returned to Syria, or in the case of Denmark, where their temporary protected status has been revoked because Denmark has deemed it is now safe for Syrians to return to Syria, we're getting all kinds of stories about how when they return, they are arrested, they are tortured, and the regime has also invoked something called Law 10, which requires that any refugee returning back, trying to reclaim their home, must provide documentation of ownership. And for refugees who fled with nothing, it's almost impossible to provide this documentation. So it is absolutely not safe or a good idea for any displaced Syrians to return to Syria. But of course, half of those displaced in Syria are displaced within Syria.
And I was going to say, so, you know, when I remember the initial work of the Multi-Faith Alliance for Syrian Refugees, and remembering the gathering together of resources among this group of people who often know each other or, you know, appear at events together, but may not have necessarily done concentrated work together. And with this idea of building respect for religious difference, how would you say that this, and certainly with the longevity of the Multi-Faith Alliance, what are some of the success stories? What are some of the high notes that we know of how religious groups have interacted across lines that were uncrossable before this conflict began?
So before getting more deeply into that question, the issue of religious difference is part of the refugee processing issue. Because if one looks, for example, at the difference in response to Syrian refugees, where borders to them have been closed all over the place, and Ukrainian refugees who were receiving such a warm welcome, which they should, they absolutely should, but so should Syrians. But Syrians are Muslims, Syrians are Arabs. Some of the Syrian refugees are Christians. About 10% of the Syrian population is Christian. So one has to ask the question. And here it was very clearly demonstrated in the US, the difference in attitudes. You know, we are immediately implementing family unification for Ukrainian refugees. To my mind, that's not enough. We should be going far beyond just family unification. But when it comes to refugee policy toward Muslim majority countries, policy is driven by misinformation, disinformation, and fear. Primarily three great fears. One of them is fear of negative economic impact. That's easily debunked. There is no negative economic impact. The second is fear of terrorism. Well, by letting people languish for 17 to 27 years, we are leaving them vulnerable to radicalization. So by not rescuing them, we are perpetuating the very thing we fear the most. That said, no Syrian refugees have ever been involved in any kind of terrorist activity here in the US. and no Syrians who've been living in the US before this crisis, 90,000 of them. And the third great fear is Islamophobia. So that's some background in terms of the impact that religious difference has on public policy. Now, religious difference as it applied to what I think was the greatest success of the Multi-Faith Alliance. And that was bringing together, as you said in your introduction, Mark, Syrians and Israelis, sworn enemies, who were able to rise above their suspicions and their hatred, to literally trust each other with their lives in order to alleviate terrible suffering in Syria. And I think the best example of that was we had lobbied, the Multi-Faith Alliance had lobbied in the UK Parliament, the EU Parliament, the Canadian Parliament, banging on doors in Congress, meeting with every level of government in Israel, for Israel to be used as a staging area for the outbound delivery of humanitarian aid. Why? Because Israel shares a border with Syria, and the border it shares happens to be with a part of Syria that was very difficult to access because it was entirely surrounded by regime-held areas, and the regime did not allow humanitarian aid to go to any parts of Syria it did not control. But that part of Syria is extremely easy to access through the Golan Heights. And Israel, after a couple of years, announced Operation Good Neighbor, in which it was willing to open the border in order to facilitate the delivery of massive amounts of humanitarian aid directly into Syria. So you had this man bites dog story that came out of that, because the very first organizations to take advantage of the opening of this channel were Syrian organizations. So, you know, for all those countries that would not get involved with Israel in terms of humanitarian operations in Syria because it was politically toxic, you know, my answer to that is, well, if Syrians were the first ones who wanted to take advantage of this, how about you? So you would have this completely what's wrong with this picture site of huge cargo containers of aid. Multi-Faith Alliance would source everything in the containers, we would ship it, and it would arrive at the Israeli ports of Haifa and Ashdod. From there, IDF soldiers, the Israeli Defense Force soldiers, would pick up the cargo containers, which contain goods with the logos of Syrian organizations all over them, transship them through Israel to the Golan Heights. From there, our partners on the ground in Syria would pick up the contents of the container and distribute them throughout Southwest Syria. Now, this accomplished three things. Number one, it delivered extremely important life-saving aid. And in addition, we were supporting 3 medical centers inside the Syrian border and a pita factory that produced 15,000 pitas a day. Number two, it built bridges, very much inspired by Tanenbaum's Peacemakers in Action program. Number three, it actually helped to stabilize an entire region, because for the 2 years that Operation Good Neighbor was going on, extremists could not take hold in that part of Syria because we were working through local councils, so supporting civil society, we were supporting a rudimentary economy, and we were providing for the basic needs of people. And there was even an article written which said that this was the only part of Syria that was actually working. So that's what I define as humanitarian diplomacy. You'll find other definitions if you Google it, but my definition is building bridges through humanitarian aid and planting the seeds for future stability in a region, which is exactly what we were doing.
Fascinating. You know, when I think about, and I've seen the reports, I get my email blasts regularly on the work that Multi-Faith Alliance is doing. I'm particularly interested in, as you talk in the book about your own history as a refugee. And we know that being a refugee or an internally displaced person has a particular impact on children and a particular effect on children. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit from what you've shared in the book, and also perhaps from your own experience of what are the things that we have to address that are not going away, that are certainly even more amplified by COVID, by climate change, by wiggling economies, if you will. Would love to have your thoughts about that and the impact of being a refugee or an IDP and a child.
Well, first of all, Syrian children, a huge percentage of them have been out of school for years, which means that we're basically losing an entire generation. And children who have been out of school and who live in despair and who are terrified are also vulnerable to radicalization. That doesn't mean all of them will be radicalized, of course not. But it's something that we need to think about, because again, rescuing these people is not just a matter of doing the right thing from a moral point of view. It's a matter of national security. Because if we don't welcome them, especially these Muslim refugees, this is one of the prime recruitment tools that ISIS uses, the West's hatred of Muslims. So by welcoming them, we take that away from ISIS. Now, another aspect of being a displaced child or an internally displaced child or a refugee. One of the big reasons that Syrians, especially Syrian women, fled Syria was because of the use of rape as a weapon of war. Syrian women subject to multiple rapes by multiple people, separately or all together. And then when they reach safety, I'll put that in air quotes, being raped again. Because those who are in camps are dangerous places, even though there is a lot of security. But about 90% of Syrian refugees are not in camps. They are what are called urban refugees, scattered, wherever they can squat, very vulnerable, without services, without protection. And in order to avoid rape, many families were forcing their daughters into child marriages. But of course, a child marriage, that just means you're getting raped all the time. So to protect them from rape, and also because the families just could not support them anymore. So that's another fallout of being a child refugee. And of course, this is a traumatized population. So how do you educate a traumatized population? Refugee camps all have education programs, but children are not required to attend those. And if they are, you need to use special techniques. Mark, you may recall that some years ago, the Tanenbaum Center and the International Rescue Committee partnered in doing an education program in the West Bank, which was a blend, a hybrid of Tanenbaum's 7 Principles of Inclusive Education, which is all about coexistence, and the International Rescue Committee's Healing Classrooms program, which is about techniques for traumatized children being able to thrive. So IRC, of course, uses that in the camps where it has education programs. So you have the issue of trauma, you have the issue of sexual violence, you have the issue of having to work at a very young age, especially urban refugees, because in Jordan, for example, and in other countries, refugees are not legally permitted to work unless they are specifically sponsored by a Jordanian national for particular work like agriculture, for example. So families often have to keep their children out of school so that they can help to support the family. So that's some of the fallout of being a displaced child. And, you know, I have a book full of letters from Syrian children. Let me just pull that out and let me read you an excerpt from one of them, for example. So here's one. I'm 16 and I come from Idlib, Syria. I want to return to my country, Syria. I can see it only in my dreams. I close my eyes and imagine my memories. I imagine my beautiful days. We're about to give up our hopes in this small container in this small camp. This war took everything from me. I lost my family, my relatives, my friends, and many of my kinsmen. When will this war end? When will the alarm for returning to home sound? When will the blood, fear of death, sounds of bombs, sounds of guns stop? I think that's a good way for me to wrap up my answer to that question.
So I don't quite have the word for it. Let me ask this. Certainly all of us doing work around building respect or trying to alleviate the hatred in the world are facing compassion fatigue. And how do we convince people, and how are you finding to convince people to continue to work together to help refugees when there are so many issues and so many causes, and almost everything seems like it has no realistic end?
So there is a process that I use in terms of the things that I focus on, which I've used in a number of settings, whether it was the New York City Police Department or the Tanenbaum Center, the women's movement. When you're faced with an overwhelming crisis and you look at it and you say, what can one person possibly do? The first thing that I say is don't look at the picture, the big picture, because you will be paralyzed into inaction. What you have to do is you have to find an entry point. And when you find an entry point, identify a gap and then find something doable that can address that gap. If you do those 3 things, then you will be able to feel like you can really have some impact on an overwhelming crisis. And you have to stay tightly focused on that thing. So we've done this in terms of all our signature programs at the Tanenbaum Center. We have always done things using a different angle than any other organizations were doing. In terms of our education programs, we focused on the primary grades. Why? Because all the other programs were focusing on the later grades. And as we know, it's in those early years that lifelong attitudes are formed. And that also goes to the question you asked before, Mark. And not only that, everybody was afraid to teach about religion. And we had to show a way it could be done without violating the Constitution. And then when it came to our workplace programs, in Workplace 2000, everybody was looking at what the workplace of the future would look like. And diversity was a huge piece of that. But nobody was looking at the religious dimension of workplace diversity, even though it was obvious that with changing demographics, this was going to become a big issue in the workplace. So Tanenbaum filled that gap, addressed that need, and did something doable in that space. Ditto with healthcare and the religious dimension of patient-centered care. And finally, our Peacemakers in Action program. There was a lot of organizations doing conflict resolution work. We sure didn't invent that. There were some organizations, fewer, that were focusing on the religious dimension of conflict resolution, the role of religion in conflict resolution. But nobody was using a case study approach that was focusing on the individuals who intervene at the grassroots in a conflict zone. So Tanenbaum did that. So there are several examples of how one applies that process to an overwhelming problem, because all of these issues were overwhelming problems.
I know it well, the history of our programs. And, and I'm glad now that those who are listening and those who will listen to the recording will also know that important history and that important framework for doing what seems impossible, that there is a way and you have to find your way in. I love that. Thank you. And let's talk about the peace building program for a second. We definitely have talked about in the case studies that we've written, we now have the podcast case studies of two of our more recent peacemakers, Dishani Jayawera from Sri Lanka and Reverend Jackie Manapudi from Indonesia. We discuss a great deal about modeling transformed relationships and the importance of working intentionally across religious, political, ethnic divides. I would love if you could talk a little bit about the transformed relationships that you are seeing in the work that is being done in Syria. What are some of the takeaways, and maybe what are some of the ways in which the Peacemakers in Action Network may have informed some of those actions or some of those relationships?
Well, I cite the Peacemakers in Action Network in a number of places in the book because it's certainly very relevant. As you know, Mark, but maybe some of the people in our audience don't know, our focus there is on religiously motivated individuals who are operating at the grassroots in conflict zones. Well, the people who came together doing this work, and let me just focus on the Syrian-Israeli piece of it. I mean, the Multi-Faith Alliance is now made up of more than 100 partner organizations, most of which are faith-based and all different religions. So it goes without saying that we are working across religious lines. But the Syrian and Israeli case, all of the people were religiously motivated. I certainly was. What I was doing absolutely came out of my Jewish values. I mentioned Leviticus 19:16 earlier, thou shalt not stand by idly. I was absolutely influenced by the religious obligation to care for the stranger, which is mentioned more than 40 times in the Hebrew scriptures, and to provide refuge. So I was a Jew in the equation. My Muslim colleagues were also motivated by religion, but not in the same way. It wasn't that they were motivated by scripture. They were motivated by the fact that you had an Alawite minority closely aligned with Shiite Muslims ruling over an 80% Sunni majority. And then you had one of my first Israeli partners who was very much driven by Jewish values, and her grandfather, who had been a rabbi. So religious values were very much part of our motivation. And in order to establish trust, for 2 years, the Syrians and Israelis had meetings in European capitals, secret meetings, where a small group of Syrian influentials and a small group of Israeli influentials would meet. And we would work out a roadmap. We would work out areas of potential partnerships. And there were plenty of landmines along the way, points at which things blew up, where the Syrians felt that the Israelis were betraying them, and the Israelis felt that the Syrians were betraying them. But in the end, we were able to get something extraordinary done. And you could see how hearts and minds had changed, not only within our small group, but certainly in Syria. And one of my favorite examples of that is that the Israelis were very concerned about going public with the work that they were doing with Syrians, because they were concerned that the Syrian lives would be in danger, because by virtue of working with Israelis, these Syrians were putting a target on their back. But one of our Syrian partners, who happened to own a media empire, kept pushing to go public, and the Israelis wouldn't do it. So finally, he went public. He happened to own the most popular TV station in Syria, which broadcast throughout the Middle East. It was an independent station. It was not state-run. And he ran a 45-minute interview with 3 Syrians who were working with Israelis. Al Jazeera picked up the story, and Al Jazeera bashed these 3 Syrians as traitors for working with Israelis. And when that story was posted on the Al Jazeera Facebook, about 90% of the comments that were posted, and this is all in Arabic, right? This is not Al Jazeera USA. This is Al Jazeera, Al Jazeera. And about 90% of the comments bashed Al Jazeera for bashing these Syrians, you know, basically saying, what are you talking about? The Israelis are helping us. What are you doing? And bringing it down to a human level, Shadi Martini, who is a Syrian refugee, who is now the executive director of the Multi-Faith Alliance, and you got to know Shadi. Yeah. Went back to Syria. This is early on, to see a friend of his, somebody who had been a very close friend. And when he arrived, the guy had, you know, a long beard and a black and white banner behind him that was similar to the ISIS banner. And Shadi said to him, "What happened to you? You were never religious." He said, "I'm still not religious. It's just, you know, the extremists get all the money and the weapons and the moderates get nothing." But Shadi then went on to say, "You know, I need to tell you about something." And his friend got pretty worried, and he said, "Well, what is it?" And he said, "Well, you know, I'm working with Israelis." And the friend looked at him and he said, "Israelis? Oh, that's fine. I thought you were going to say you were working with Hezbollah. Listen, invite the Israelis to lunch next time. So this kind of changing of hearts and minds, and it wasn't only on the Syrian side, obviously. I mean, that's more dramatic because of the indoctrination that goes on. But listen, you know, Israelis also have their prejudices. And those too fell away. You know, when you saw the most heartwarming thing for me at our meetings was seeing the Syrians and the Israelis laughing together, eating together, telling stories together. And maybe the most heartwarming sight of all was when our very first cargo container arrived at the Golan Heights. Now, they arrived because this was a military operation at the Northern Command of the IDF, right? So we were on a military base. And so the Israeli soldiers are walking around with their Uzis hanging on their shoulders, and the Syrians are standing there. But the Israelis are not pointing those Uzis at the Syrians. And instead, the Syrians and the Israeli soldiers are joking together. And when we finally cracked open that cargo container, everybody cheered. That to me was one of the most wonderful moments.
Well, we have a little bit of time left, and I know that there very well may be some questions that some of the people who are participating with us would want to ask. So if you have a question for Dr. Bennett, if you would please post it in the Q&A, which is on the navigation bar next to the chat. Would be happy to share your question with Dr. Bennett. And while we're waiting for a question or two to come in, Georgette, I would love if you could talk a little bit about what continues to inspire you today to continue doing this work. You know, you are our stalwart president and founder at Tanenbaum, the founder at the Multi-Faith Alliance, any number of international organizations that look to you for leadership and guidance and wisdom. You are a generous, you and Leonard are both generous philanthropists, but what keeps you going today?
Well, speaking of Leonard, he keeps me going. And he has been extraordinarily supportive of the Multi-Faith Alliance and put up with all my absences and preoccupation. So what keeps me going? Scenes like I just described to you keep me going. And the sense of having some impact keeps me going. You know, the Multi-Faith Alliance has now delivered $225 million worth of aid, benefiting more than 2.3 million Syrian war victims. It's so seldom that we can measure our impact. And that, to me, that is hugely motivating. And I remain very inspired by my late husband and Tanenbaum's namesake, Rabbi Mark Tanenbaum, to keep building bridges. I love building bridges. I love seeing preconceptions and stereotypes fall away and to see people connecting. I know it sounds hokey, but it's as simple as that.
We do have a question from Julie, who asks, do you see any openings for meaningful change in our country's long-standing nativism and unwillingness to welcome refugees? Is there anything you could imagine moving the needle?
Yes, so there's been a fair amount of research in terms of the kind of messaging that moves the needle when it comes to refugees. And part of the message is, number one, refugees don't want to be here. Refugees want to be home. They didn't flee because they wanted to. They fled because they have to. Number two, people love hearing stories about successful integration of refugees. And that has 5 components. Successful integration means housing, work, language, education, and trauma treatment. That's what it takes to successfully integrate refugees. I think we need to separate what moves the needle in terms of policymakers and what moves the needle in terms of the general public. I mentioned the 3 great fears earlier. And if you were to look at the Multi-Faith Alliance website, and also in my book, you'll see some of this, but not in the same detail. Each of these 3 great fears, it can be debunked with the facts, and the facts are very surprising. So policymakers need facts. The public in general needs stories, human stories.
Would you say that those stories would be ones where they could see them, not just have sympathy, but that they could actually have empathy, where they could see and or hear themselves in the story?
Absolutely, absolutely. But let me address another part of Julie's question, because she's absolutely correct that we do not have a good history of welcoming refugees in this country. With every successive wave of refugees that we have had, public opinion has always been opposed to it, with the sole exception of ethnic Albanians in 1980s, was it? I can't remember the year. So what we have needed was a leader who was willing to buck public opinion, which we have had in each of those cases, and admit those refugees. And invariably, those refugees have proven to be a great benefit to the US.
Another question. Recently, Bashar al-Assad was received by the leader of Abu Dhabi with all due protocols. This is from Ingrid. I was taken aback to see him being treated as the leader of Syria. Would other countries replicate it and recognize him as president? How can public opinion put pressure for his crimes not to be ignored and avoid things going back to normal, forgetting the millions of victims he leaves behind?
So there is some movement in the Middle East normalizing relations with Assad. But at the same time, Germany, for example, has actually started trying some of his close associates for war crimes. So we have to see how this plays out. Of course, without Russia to prop him up and without Iran to prop him up, he would not be in office. And let's keep in mind that the Russian and the Iranian engagement in Syria is very costly. Russia is now also in Ukraine, very costly. And these are both countries with very, very weak economies.
Thank you. So the last question we have time for is from someone you know quite well, Judy Banky.
Uh-oh. Hi, Judy. Hi, Judy.
And she says, thanks for an inspiring story, and asked the question, when the Islamists closed the border between Syria and Israel, did that also close off the interaction between Arab and Jewish medical teams that so effectively challenged stereotypes and prejudices?
Well, it's not the Islamists who closed the border. it was a deconfliction agreement that was made in August of 2018, which required that Israel close that operation. It was a deal made between Russia and Turkey, Iran, where a number of promises were made by Russia, none of which have been kept. But when we expanded our delivery areas from the Southwest to the Northeast and the Northwest, have found ways to keep Israel engaged so that we can preserve those partnerships. Now, there was another part to Judy's question. Mark, remind me.
She was asking particularly about the interaction between Arab and Jewish.
Oh, the medical teams. So Israel treated about 5,000 Syrians who came to the border for medical treatment. But that too had to stop with this deconfliction agreement.
Well, we are almost at our time. I can't tell you how much I have enjoyed this. I want to remind everyone, if you do not have the book, Thou Shalt Not Stand Idly By, can be purchased anywhere where you purchase books. So Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, The Strand, and Bookshop. We will be dropping links into the chat so that you can find the book. I want to thank you all and remind everyone that this is one of our first conversations in our 3000 Conversation series. And if you would like to, you could watch the recording of this session with friends or colleagues and talk about the insights that we've discussed. You can read the book, Thou Shalt Not Stand Idly By, and include this in maybe your book club. And all of those would be opportunities that build respect for religious difference. We're dropping into the chat the place where you can log those conversations, because we want to know if we're getting to 3,000 or not. So there is a website where you can go and upload your experience of the conversation that you were in, or if you were a host of a conversation and what that experience was like. You can record video or you can type in your response. It's a very forgiving website, so anyone can do it. We hope that this conversation this evening has really helped to illuminate how important and impactful hosting intentional and courageous conversations can be. And also want to kind of give you a heads up that Dr. Bennett will be publishing another book in November of this year. I can say the title, right? Yes.
Absolutely.
So the new book will be called Religicide, and you can look it up. You can. It's available for advanced orders now. Definitely on Amazon. You won't be able to get it until the publication date in November, but you can certainly pre-order it. And if you are unable, for those of you who will listen to the recording or may have registered, we will be posting this conversation to our YouTube page in a little bit, not tonight, but in the next day or two. Look for that. And please also look for us on all social media platforms. You can search us by, look for Tanenbaum Center, and please be sure to like us, follow us, and share the importance of this important information and all of our content. It is, as I mentioned, our 30th anniversary year, and so we have a great deal of programming yet to go. Next up will be our 6th annual Religious Diversity Leadership Summit that we hold for our corporations that we work with and for the corporate space. Please, you can save the dates of May 17th and 18th. It'll be a 2-day fully virtual event, and we'll be exploring more opportunities of how religious diversity shows up in the workplace. Our theme this year is Imagine, Create, Build, Embrace Religious Diversity. I want to thank you all so much for joining us. Georgette, thank you so much for your continued inspiration and for sharing yourself so personally in this book and this model that we all have for the difference that we can make.
And Mark, thank you for being such a thoughtful and interesting interlocutor.
I learned from the best. Thank you everyone for joining us, and have a wonderful evening and or day whenever you listen to this recording. Thank you.